The anime starts by showing us the thoughts of a Japanese man who'd get jostled about on a packed train to work every day, and he'd barely catch the last train home. That was the monotonous life he once lived, but he's been reincarnated in another world and appointed lord of a remote village, a village that he's going to develop with his power. Despite this, one day, he wakes up and notices how small his hands are now, realizing that he's in the body of a little kid. He quickly approaches the window to see outside and sees a whole kingdom he barely recognizes. His confusion gets interrupted by his personal maid, who panics and quickly pulls him away from the window, saying that it's dangerous. He apologizes for worrying her and explains that the scenery outside was just so magnificent he was overwhelmed. The maid gets surprised and asks him where he learned such difficult words, since he's only 2 years old. This information confuses him greatly, and he realizes that even though he does seem to have some vague memories of living here, this might be that reincarnation thing he's heard about. He looks at the maid and tells her that her name is Till and she's his personal maid. When the maid confirms it, he then knows that his name is Van Fertio, and Till is just happy to know that he's able to say his family name too. To her surprise, he also tells her that his father's name is Jalpa, and he's Marquis Fertio. His older brothers are Murcia, Jard, and Sesto, but for some reason, the only thing he doesn't know is where he is right now. Once the family gathers to have breakfast that morning, we see Van's father, Marquis Jalpa Bul Ati Fertio. His eldest son is introduced as Murcia Elago Fertio, the second son is Jard Guy Fertio, and the third son is Sesto Ele Fertio. While everyone enjoys a quiet meal, Van gets totally spoiled by the maids, who baby him and praise him for every little thing. Deep down, he starts to wonder if he's a VIP at a hostess club and doesn't complain at all. However, all jokes aside, it seems he's been reborn in this world with his memories of his time in Japan intact, and that's all he knows for now. Marquis Fertio decides to speak and asks his second son, Jard, what he'll be studying today. Jard nervously tells him that he'll be learning about fire magic and battle formations. Jalpa then asks Sesto what he'll be doing, and the boy tells him that he'll be studying magic. Lastly, Jalpa asks Van what he will do, and he calmly tells him that there is a lot he doesn't know. So he was thinking of starting by studying their nation's culture and history. That elaborate answer from a 2-year-old shocks everyone at the table, but his father only smiles for once, and then starts laughing loudly, clearly pleased. Jalpa says that he thought he'd been spoiling him since he's the last child of his late wife Mura, but at 2, he's already a fine young lad. He's positive he'll possess powerful fire magic like Mura and himself, so the future of House Fertio is secure. He looks forward to his magical aptitude appraisal when he turns 8, and he has high hopes for him. In no time, Van understands that a person's magical aptitude is apparently important in this world. Their offensive capabilities make them useful for protecting people, so nobles desire one of the 4 elemental magics: fire, water, wind, or earth. Those with an aptitude for other types are seen as a disgrace. Van's father and all of his brothers possess one of the 4 elemental magics, so he knows that there are high expectations for him. Knowing this, he decides to learn more about this world and asks his maid everything about it. He asks her if this is the only port where ships can sail, and she explains that huge monsters lurk in the deep ocean, so they'd come under attack anywhere else. Van then asks her about the races there are, and Till informs him that there are a lot of different races, like elves, dwarves, and more. The other maids stop her, saying that that's too complicated for him, so Till nervously apologizes. Van reassures her, saying that he's asking her because he wants to learn a lot more. He asks her if she could teach him about magic tools, and Till quickly accepts, explaining that there are magic crystals, a number of gemstones, and some rocks and ores that can store magic. People can make magic tools related to their magical aptitude with them, which is really useful. The conversation gets suddenly interrupted when the butler suddenly places a large pile of books in front of Van. He says that since he's currently 2, he knows that he's learning to read and do basic numeracy, but he wants to know how much he actually knows. Van looks up and sees Esparta, a talented butler who has apparently been in his father's service for many years, but he finds him kind of scary. Van nervously tells him that his reading's not so good, and he can do a little addition and subtraction. Esparta immediately decides to test him, and raises 3 fingers on one hand and 2 on the other, asking him what he gets if he puts them together. Van reluctantly says 5, and that's when Esparta makes the decision of becoming his tutor. Unable to refuse, Van has no choice but to stand a series of hellish lessons every day. Despite how tortuous it was, as a result of those lessons, he was able to read and write within a few weeks, and he learned a lot. He doesn't know how this is suitable for a 2-year-old though, but he spends the next 2 years studying from dawn to dusk. Now he's finally turned 4, and he's currently struggling with a sword duel against Till. Even though he tries his best, Till simply has fun teasing him, easily dodging all his moves. When Van falls defeated, Till proudly says that she wins, and then runs while laughing before he can hit her with his wooden sword. The fun gets suddenly interrupted when one of the other maids stops Till and tells her that she must really not value her life if she's insulting Van like that. The other maids show up and ask Van to punish that insolent woman, but he doesn't understand why he should, since he really doesn't mind. The head maid tells him that that won't do, and explains that it would normally be a crime for someone to be so rude to a noble. As the other maids hold her up, Till cries and waits for her punishment, but they all go still when Van simply flicks her forehead and says that the matter is settled. The head maid tries to to protest, but he insists and gives Till a kind smile. Van studies swordsmanship every day, and by the time he's 5, he's able to fight on equal terms with the older soldiers in training. Since he's facing children, their attacks tend to be simplistic, and his experience from his past life makes a huge difference. Soon, all the kids know just how good he is with a sword, which makes them think he really is a prodigy. And despite being a noble, he's always kind with the other kids, and makes sure they're okay after every duel. Unlike Jard and Sesto, he even talks to the kids with lower status, who think that he's a really strange young boy for that. While he's on a break, Van is approached by D, the chivalric order's deputy commander, who takes a look at his hands and is surprised to see no calluses. He figured he must have been training at night, but his skin is still soft. Van tells him that his studies are too tough for that, so there's no way he could manage training at night. D then tells him that he heard Esparta was ordered to make him study 3 times harder than normal. That information entirely shocks Van, who realizes how odd it was that he was the only one studying from morning to night. D takes the opportunity and excitedly tells him that if he'd like to learn swordplay as well, he'll plead his case for him. After all, that butler is way too devoted to academic subjects, and he must pursue the path of the sword, so he'll make him this nation's greatest swordsman. Van can already know that D is dead serious about that, and the idea doesn't please him in the slightest. He nervously says that he likes the sword, but he also likes studying, so he'll do his best at both. D respects his decision, but tells him that at the very least, he'll instruct him personally for his sword lessons. Seeing Van's clear concern, D tries to reassure him, saying that he'll go easy on him because he's still just a child. However, that was a blatant lie, because he doesn't go easy on him at all during training. Van does as much as he can do with his small body, but D shows no mercy, and even asks him to do 100 upswings with the heavy training sword, 100 mid-sweeps, 100 thrusts, and a lot more. By the end of the day, Van feels completely destroyed, and even as he tries to take a break, D asks him to try resting in a squatting position instead of using a chair. Van clearly doesn't understand that guy, but even though it's been rough, every day has been fun since he was reincarnated. He feels a satisfaction he never experienced in his past life, so he knows that he should enjoy this fun life he has in this world to the fullest. However, after being reincarnated, Van becomes regarded as a prodigy by the time he turns 6. Every day he went through hell with his studies and his swordplay training, so he ended up awfully worn out. The same thing, day after day, was getting to be too much, and at that rate, he was never going to get to enjoy his new life. That's why one day, he decides to become a slacker so he could be a normal child instead of a prodigy. To take a break, he visits the market for the first time with Till and 2 knights from the chivalric order, Arb and Law. Van is excited to see how lively the market is, because there's a lot of activity there. Till informs him that this is the biggest market in the city, and it's next to the Merry Chamber of Commerce, a huge company that has branches all over the kingdom. The conversation gets interrupted when they see a man dragging an unhealthy-looking kid in terrible conditions with a rope. Arb and Law immediately stand on guard, but Van stops them and calmly asks the man why that boy is bound by rope. The man tells him that he can do whatever he likes with his own son, and he's here to sell him into slavery. Van is clearly surprised to hear that, so Till explains that for a long time now, poor families have sold children they can't feed into slavery to earn money to live on. Van finds that appalling, but before he can say anything, a woman comes out of the Merry Chamber of Commerce and recognizes him as the Marquis's young son. Till happily confirms it and tells her that he's the famous prodigy, Van Ferdio. The woman runs downstairs to greet him, saying that everyone's been talking about him. She welcomes him to the Merry Chamber of Commerce, where they have everything he needs. The woman introduces herself as Rosalie and tells him that it's a pleasure to have the chance to serve him. Van tells her that that man came here to sell that boy into slavery, so he wants to know how much he would go for. Rosalie sees the boy and asks the man if he has any magical aptitude, so the man informs her that he has aptitude for thieving magic. She tells him that they wouldn't go any higher than 3 large silvers in that case, and that immediately makes the man rage. He harshly throws the boy to the ground and violently stomps on his body, saying that he's not even worth much. Rosalie tries to stop him, but the man ignores her and harshly pulls on the rope, saying that he'll go to a different shop. Before he can leave, Van speaks up and tells the man that he'll buy him for 5 large silvers. Till quickly gets the silver coins for him, so the man takes the money and runs away without looking back, leaving his son behind. Van approaches the boy to make sure he's okay, and quickly cuts the ropes with a knife to free him. The boy takes the hand offered to him and introduces himself as Kamsen, and Van informs him that he's now free, so he can go anywhere he wants. Despite this new opportunity, it's clear that the boy has nowhere to go, so Van invites him to go with him. However, the knights tell him that the Marquis won't allow a child of unknown origin into the mansion, and it'd be a different story if he brought him as a slave. Van apologizes and asks Kamsen if he's alright with that, and the boy quickly agrees. Rosalie then decides to finalize the slave contract, taking both their hands to seal it. A mark appears on the top of Kamsen's hand, and she tells him that it's the seal of his slave contract. This seal will remain as long as the contract isn't nullified, and since it's Van's first time patronizing them, they'll waive the contract fee. Van makes sure to thank her, and that takes her by surprise, because she can't believe that she was actually thanked by a noble. After making it official, Kamsen starts working for Van at the mansion, having a new uniform and looking way better than when they met. One day, Kamsen informs him that Deputy Commander D is looking for him, but Van simply offers him him a cookie and asks him to tell him that he's not here. Kamsen gladly accepts the cookie, though he tells him that D probably already knows he's here. Van leaves that aside and notices that he's not wearing his gloves, so Kamsen explains that he likes showing off his slave mark because it symbolizes his bond with him. Despite that, as soon as Van reminds him that he bought those gloves for him, Kamsen puts them back on right away. He then walks out of the office and tells D that Van isn't there, but D mentions that he saw him enter that room earlier. Kamsen confidently tells him that that was probably a hallucination born from their strong feelings for Van. D easily believes him, but after seeing the cookie crumbles around his mouth, he already knows that Van probably bribed him. Kamsen reminds him that he's Van's slave, and D recognizes that he has an impressive courage to talk back to him like that. That's why he decides that he'll train him in Van's stead and drags him away without letting him protest. Van silently asks Kamsen to forgive him from his hiding spot, knowing that he's going to suffer with D's training. By the time Van finally turns 8, everyone in the kingdom already knows that it's time to appraise his magical aptitude, and they're looking forward to the results, hoping that he becomes their lord. Each of House Ferdio's sons has an aptitude for either fire or wind magic, so there's high expectations for Van, and they're pretty sure that he'll possess fire magic. However, once it's finally time to appraise his magical aptitude, Jalpa is completely horrified to find out that he has no aptitude for any of the 4 elemental magics. And worse still, his aptitude is for production magic, known as the most unfortunate type of all. That's because it allows him to create swords and accessories by preparing materials and visualizing the result in his mind, but those things can be produced without magic, so it's clearly a useless ability. Jalpa asks him how he's supposed to protect their people with that kind of magic, but Van is unable to speak at his harsh words. His father tells him that his late wife, Mura, was a powerful fire mage like himself, so he doesn't understand how they gave birth to a production mage. He's the last child Mura left him before her passing, so he finds this situation very insulting. Jalpa suddenly grabs his sword, saying that he was a fool for getting his hopes up after he displayed rare talents that belied his age, and he can't believe that their house has produced such a disgraceful failure. Van doesn't know what to do, but he knows that this is bad, and he's most likely about to get killed. Jalpa raises his sword to end the life of his own son, but that's when Mura steps in the way to save him. He calmly explains that there's a remote village that remains undeveloped due to its location, despite being part of their march, so they should entrust Van with it. It has just over 100 residents, it has no important industry, and strong monsters roam the resource-rich mountains to the north. The village neighbors Ferdinando County, and on the other side is the rival kingdom of Yeleneta. The village currently only has value only as a field camp for rare training exercises. Jalpa takes a moment to consider it, knowing that, since that village is newly acquired territory, they're not very loyal to their house yet. Even just symbolically appointing one of their family members to it should change things. That's why Jalpa decides to accept the proposal, and tells Van that he'll become the lord of that village, so he must go as soon as he's ready. He praises Mura before leaving, saying that he has managed to find a good use for the useless. Once they're left alone, Mura kneels before Van and apologizes, saying that he couldn't bear to see anything horrible happen to him, so he made a rash proposal. Van tells him that if he hadn't said something, his father might have killed him then and there, so he's grateful for what he did. Mura tells him that he'll do what he can to help him, even though it might not amount to much. Soon enough, Van is packing up all his things with Kamsen's help, and he's actually looking forward to going to that village now. A lord of a rural town won't have much to do, so he'll have free time for sure, and he'll be able to live a fun, laid-back life. His luggage is loaded into a carriage, but he wasn't allowed any chivalric order knights, so he now has about 10 adventurers his brother Mura hired. At first, they were only going to let him take Kamsen, which would have been awful, so he's really grateful to Mura, even though he thought this was as much as he was going to get, till suddenly rushes to him and reminds him that she's his personal maid, so she's going with him. Surprisingly, D tells him that he'll accompany him as well, because he plans to teach him everything he knows about the sword. Of course, Van doesn't like the idea at all, and reminds him that he wasn't allowed to take anyone from the chivalric order. D makes it clear that he didn't know anything about that, and of course, Arbin Law will also go with him. Esparta also joins Van, saying that he took an early retirement because he'll supervise his studies as a spot of entertainment in his old age. Van doesn't look thrilled at all, but there's nothing he can do about it, so he finally leaves the kingdom in secret, because it was his father's intention to send him away without anyone knowing. However, before they can exit the capital, a young girl approaches the carriage to say goodbye, and that's when he notices that Arbin Law are making sure everyone knows he's departing, all under D's orders. Thanks to this, all the people in the kingdom give him a grand goodbye, asking him to come back soon and to take care. Even though it wasn't planned, Van happily waves goodbye to everyone, making sure to thank them for everything. While they're on the carriage, Van tries to use his production magic for the first time and manages to turn a stick into a small sword. Till informs him that they'll be at the village soon, and Van is relieved to hear that, since they've traveled pretty far. Before they arrive, he tells Kamsen that he can return to the Marquis Manor if he hates it here. Van clarifies that he can release him from his slave contract, and if he talks to his brother Mura, he'll see he's treated right. Kamsen tells him that he's already decided to dedicate his life to him, so no matter the danger, he'll serve him and stay with him forever. Van nervously asks him if he just proposed, wanting to know if he really loves him that much. Kamsen confirms that without hesitation conversation, saying that he admires him deeply, though Van starts realizing just how intense he really is. Before he can say anything else, the carriage abruptly stops, and the knights inform Van that the village seems to be under attack right now. Van immediately gets out of the carriage for a quick meeting to decide what they're going to do. Dee tells him that the people attacking the village must be bandits or washed-up mercenaries since they're used to combat. Van observes their attacks and analyzes the situation, knowing that the village is surrounded by a palisade, but it's ineffective against arrows. Tough-looking men stand in front of the gate, so the villagers must keep up their turtle-like defense. At a rough estimate, the enemy numbers 50 men, and by contrast, he only has some chivalric knights and a group of adventurers. Dee instantly asks Van to let him join the battle, saying that if they attack together, they should be able to stop them. One of the adventurers speaks up, saying that that's way too dangerous, given their numbers. Dee recognizes him as Ortho the adventurer, and tells him that he's aware of the danger, and they'll probably take losses, but they can drive them away for sure. Ortho reminds him that they were only hired to guard Van until he reached the village, so he'd never accept a quest that would risk his comrades dying. Dee tells him that this village is their lord's first territory, and the villagers are his first citizens, so they must draw swords now that they're in danger. Ortho admits that that's a splendid display of chivalry, but that has nothing to do with adventurers like them. Dee gets frustrated, knowing that he can't make them change their minds, so he at least asks them all to protect Van, saying that they can flee if it all goes south. Ortho accepts the simple request, but Esparta immediately opposes the idea, saying that if Dee dies, the village will have no future, even if they take control. Dee asks him what they should do in that case, and Esparta informs them that he's actually an elemental mage, so they can count on his combat prowess. He's going to erect a defensive wall first, so the adventurers must fire ranged attacks from behind it. Once the enemy's focus is on them, Dee and his men will charge in from the flank, because a sequence of surprise attacks improves their chances of victory. Van asks him if he's planning to stay behind and fight, and Esparta confirms it, saying that if he doesn't act as a decoy and continues attacking from behind the wall, Dee and his men will die in vain. Van quickly tells him that he can't do that, because he will die for sure, but Esparta insists, saying that it is one last chance to show off his strength as an old man. He asks him to allow him this selfish request, but Van reminds him that he's contributed a lot to their house, so he can't die in a place like this. Dee and his men also can't die, because they're all members of their house's chivalric order, and they can't let them come to harm. Plus, if they lose their expert strategist Esparta and their best fighter Dee, they won't be able to develop this land, and his father would then take his life for sure. That's why Van decides that he'll be the one who will act as the decoy. Till immediately jumps in to stop him, saying that she'd rather be the decoy if the other option is him. Compson agrees, saying that he would do the same, but Van tries to make Till calm down and tells her that he doesn't want to see someone precious to him die, and that includes Compson. Van tells him that he should be free and he wants him to truly enjoy his life. That's why he informs everyone that he'll ride the carriage in and attack head-on, so the rest of them must attack from range on both flanks. Dee tries to stop him, but Van reminds him that he did sword training with him every day, so he won't die easily. Even if he does, deep down, Van thinks that there's no better end for a lord than dying for his people, and that's why he doesn't mind if they leave his corpse behind. Announcing his demise would only cause trouble for his house anyway, so he's not planning to back down now. Ortho is clearly surprised by his determination, and just then, he remembers a moment a few days earlier. He's complaining about having to guard some noble's boy, saying that there are no good men among the upper nobility, and they all look down on adventurers and the common folk. His comrades agree with him on that, but they ask him why he accepted the quest in that case. Ortho tells them that it's because he plans to keep operating in the Fertio March for a while, and he had no choice but to take the job. Just then, Van approaches him and kindly introduces himself, saying that he heard he'll be guarding him, so he wanted to thank him properly. Ortho clearly wasn't expecting the gratitude of a noble, so he doesn't know how to react. Van smiles and simply compliments how strong he looks, saying that he's rocking the veteran hero look. Ortho dismisses it, but his comrades tell him that they thought he said there were no good nobles. After Van leaves, they mention that it looks like they'll be guarding an ordinary kid, and Ortho admits that apparently not every noble is the same way. Back to the present time, Ortho can see that Van is no ordinary kid at all, so he decides to help, saying that they'll entrust their lives to him. Van tries to stop him, but Ortho says that a child saying he's willing to risk his life, so if he complained anymore, his comrades would be mad at him. Pluriel, one of the adventurers, agrees with him and admits that she used to ridicule the idea of a noble's resolve, because the nobles she met until now were all talk. However, he even took the time to memorize the names of adventurers like them, and that's why they feel that they can trust him with their lives. Van doesn't know what to say, and Dee tells him that they are honorable knights in service of the Marquis, so protecting him here and now means defending the future of the house. Esparta also tells him that he can't condone the Lord employing such an irresponsible strategy, so once they've driven them off, he'll teach him the responsibility he bears as a potential heir to the Marquis's title. Without wasting any more time, Esparta asks everyone to amend the strategy he proposed and carry it out. First, he'll create a defensive wall and fire ranged attacks, and Dee's men will take the left flank, while Ortho's group will charge in from the right. Once this is clear, Esparta immediately erects defensive walls near the village village in a matter of seconds. Ortho starts running with his group, saying that he didn't expect that old butler to be such a powerful mage. His comrade tells him that if he had turned down that boy's request, he would have risked his life in his place. Ortho admits that Van's going to be a big shot, and if possible, he would welcome that boy becoming king. The bandits continue firing their arrows, wanting to conquer the village as soon as possible. However, they're taken by surprise by Ortho's group, and just then they see the huge walls behind them. The leader of the bandits orders them to attack whatever is behind those walls, but D finishes off a bunch of them with his sword. Just as they planned, the enemy falls for their decoy, so all the adventurers and chivalric knights surround the bandits from both flanks. When some of the bandits realize who they're facing, they immediately run away from D. Their numbers drop in an instant, but their leader doesn't give up and runs directly to the other side of the walls to attack anyone there. No one manages to stop him in time, so Pluriel is taken by surprise. But before the bandit can hurt her, Van creates a distraction and manages to attack his legs from the back to immobilize him. Kamsen takes the opportunity to finish him off with his sword, and Van warns Pluriel that there's a good chance the enemy will focus on their position, so she must pay attention to what's in front of her. Pluriel is left speechless, simply wondering who this child truly is. When everything's over, Ortho informs his group that the enemy took huge losses and they suffered no casualties, so it's the best outcome possible. Once they receive their payment, this quest will be complete, but he's grown a little curious about Van now. There might not be much money in it, but he wants to know what they think about staying a while. Part of the adventurers declines the offer, saying that they're off on their next quest. After they leave, Pluriel tells him that she will stay because Van saved her life back there and she wants to repay him. The other three adventurers also decide to stay, saying that it's hard to believe a child could move like that, especially knowing that he's not even 10. Ortho agrees and tells them that he's also much nicer than any other noble he's ever known. The adventurers tell him that they want to see what this place develops into under Van, so they will stay here for a bit and help him. Meanwhile, Esparta approaches Van and informs him that he senses the villagers have gathered near the entrance. Van tells everyone that it's their first time here, so they must stride in with pride. Once they're inside, Van introduces himself, saying that he's their new lord, Van Ne Fertio. An old man introduces himself as Rhonda, saying that he's the village chief, and thanks him for saving his village. He mentions that this isn't the first time it happens, and they've been attacked several times this year alone. Van asks him why he thinks this village is being targeted so much, and Rhonda explains that back when they were part of Fortunato County, knights patrolled the area, but all of that is gone now. In other words, due to this village becoming part of the Fertio March, its survival is in jeopardy. Van apologizes for that, saying that his father, Marquis Fertio, isn't abreast of the status of the smaller villages yet. Rhonda asks him if he's saying smaller villages aren't worth protecting since they pay practically nothing in taxes. Van calmly tells him that complaining about the state of the kingdom won't do any good, but one of the villagers snaps in frustration, saying that a noble like him can't talk. Van asks him to calm down and reminds them that he's discussing the future of this village. He admits that it's true that nobles bear much responsibility, and flaws in the laws laid out by the kingdom's founders, the Belrenettes, are to blame. However, they can't change the laws of the kingdom, so there are 3 measures they can take to get protection for the village. First, they must produce something so valuable the kingdom can't ignore this village. Second, they must regularly earn enough money to hire mercenaries, and third, they must improve and develop the village themselves. A woman from the village tells him that they also came up with those solutions, but all are easier said than done. Van recognizes that they probably were a challenge until now, but now their new lord has arrived, and he'll do everything he can to defend and develop this village. Everyone goes silent at that, and Van quickly realizes that they don't trust him at all. Esparta decides to intervene, saying that he served Marquis Fertio as his head butler. He explains that Van has been entrusted with land at the age of 8, after being considered a prodigy since his younger days. D also speaks up, introducing himself as the deputy commander of Fertio's chivalric order, and saying that he's also here to serve Van. The villagers are clearly surprised and pleased to know that they have people so reliable now, so Rhonda quickly asks Van if he can use elemental magic. Van quickly clarifies that he has an aptitude for production magic, so they can't expect too much from him in combat. That immediately takes away all the excitement from the villagers. But another man from the village decides to speak up, wanting to know what they should do about taxes. After all, it's been an incredible struggle to give 30% of the harvest so far. Van decides to cut it down to 10% of the harvest for a while, since it's more important for them to secure a stable way of life first. This is amazing news for all the villagers, who immediately feel relief at the information. Van then decides to start with strengthening the village's defensive walls first, so he asks Esparta if his earth magic wall is long-lasting. Esparta tells him that it maintains its integrity while active, but when the mana ebbs away, it becomes a simple mound of dirt. Van understands that they'll need to replace it with something sturdier in that case, but he asks him to erect a wall of dirt for them as a temporary measure. Esparta complies and erects a huge earth wall around the village in seconds, surprising all the villagers. Van mentions that he would also like to build a moat because he wants to slow down any raiders. D asks him to leave that task to the knights, saying that they'll make pitfalls and snares as well. Van thinks that's a good idea, and he tells the villagers that everyone's cooperation will be vital right now, because if they stand together, this village can be reborn even stronger than before. A while after making that decision, vacation, Van decides to test out his production magic in the forest. He uses his magic on some wooden logs and feels warmth slowly growing in the pit of his stomach. Once the mana reaches his fingertips, he must sense every fiber of the wood, and then he'll spin them together to make them stronger, like plied thread, before weaving the fibers even more finely to make a wood block. Till and Kamsen stare at his creation, a little confused, so Van tells them that it's a fiber block, like that nanofiber stuff. They clearly have no idea what he's talking about, but Van continues creating these blocks with wood. The adventurers approach him to see what he's doing, and Ortho mentions that the blocks are lighter and harder than he expected. He decides to try cutting one in half with his sword, but the block remains intact without a scratch. Till mentions that these blocks are made of wood, but Ortho says that he swung at it hard enough to cut through stone. After that demonstration, Van realizes that his creation could be really useful, so he decides to continue creating stuff all day. Till and Kamsen remain by his side, and she asks him if he hasn't exhausted his mana. Van tells her that he doesn't particularly feel like he has, so Kamsen tells him that he heard the mana consumption of production magic is intense, making it hard for most folk to make even one thing. Van starts wondering how mana normally works, and while he does, he uses his production magic to turn a fiber block into a fine sword. Kamsen stares at the sword in awe, so Van decides to give it to him as a gift. Till stares at him expectantly, but her excitement dies down when Van gives her a terrifying axe. Van feels bad for her, so he decides that he'll make her a cute accessory later to make up for it. At night, his body feels sore, because they've been camping outdoors for so long. He also hasn't been able to bathe, so he feels gross, and even though Till and Kamsen act fine, he knows that they must be exhausted too. That makes him think that he should secure their basic needs before strengthening the village's defenses, so he decides that he'll try making a house. The next day, Rhonda notices a big pile of fiber blocks in the middle of the village, and Van asks him if they can build their house there. Rhonda tells him that it hasn't been used as a public square for a while now, so he thinks that it's the perfect spot to build the Lord's mansion. Van thanks him, knowing that once they have a degree of surplus, he'll work hard so they can host a harvest festival or a carnival. Once that's decided, he tries to test out if he can actually make something as large as a house with his production magic. He starts with the pillars, the four corners first, and then decides on the size, creating fine wires drilling deep into the ground to strengthen the pillars. Next, he makes the floors and walls to connect them, and finally, a roof. In only a matter of seconds, Van manages to create a big mansion with his production magic. All the villagers, and even the adventurers, are surprised to see what he created in such a short time. Just then, Van realizes that this production magic of his seems plenty useful to everyone now, though he thinks that maybe he made the house way too big. Everyone gathers around the huge mansion, and Kamsen mentions that Van's production magic is much better suited to governing a territory than elemental magic. Van admits that it's an interesting skill, but offensive magic is still the best for protecting his people. People feel much more secure living under that kind of lord. Till immediately denies it, and Kamsen tells him that he would rather live in his town than Lord Jalpa's. Van just laughs, knowing that they're both too biased toward him, but Esparta clarifies that in times of war, he would indeed be correct. However, what the people seek is a lord who will improve their lives, and in that sense, no one could better answer to the people's needs than him. Dee agrees with him, saying that he can't believe he made a whole house with his production magic. Ortho says that they're right because Van's powers far exceed those of regular production magic users. Van happily says that if they bring him the lumber, he can make houses for all of them. Everyone freezes for a moment, and Dee immediately orders Law and Arb to go gather lumber. Ortho quickly orders the adventurers the same thing, saying that they can't lose to those knights. Van can tell that they're clearly very motivated, but that's when the village chief approaches him, asking him if he can make houses for them if they bring him lumber as well. In just a moment, all the villagers surround him, and most of them say that their houses don't keep out the elements anymore, and the floors are giving out. Van starts getting a little worried with all the requests, because he'll probably wear himself out doing all that work at once. Still, he knows that their homes are in seriously bad shape, so he decides to start by dramatically renovating their lives in the village. He declares that they'll make entirely new homes for everyone, and that gets all the villagers happy. Dee gets even more excited, saying that the knights will go fetch the lumber for that. In no time, Van starts creating new houses, getting rid of all those old rotting homes that made the villagers' lives so tough. Dee observes the stunning, newly built homes, saying that it's truly magnificent work. Everyone is also shocked by Van's huge mana capacity, but they're more impressed that he knew how to construct a neighborhood like this. Van explains that this is called a grid plan, which has a 4-home block as its fundamental unit, and large streets run between the blocks in a lattice. He made all of the villagers' homes uniform to avoid any disparity, and that should suffice for now. But once they have eventually obtained lots of stone, he'll rebuild each home to better suit its residents. All the villagers are incredibly grateful toward him, so they offer Van a lot of their harvest as gifts. In addition to all the houses, Van also built a simple public bath next to his manor. He made it because he wanted to bathe, but he's glad to see the villagers also like it. He went with a simple design for the bath, and Pluriel used her water magic to fill the tub. Kamsen heated it with a charcoal fire, so it's essentially a Gomen bath now. Once the baths are ready to use, Till asks Van to go take a bath together, and Pluriel says that she'll join them too. Van immediately immediately gets flustered, so he tries to explain that he's already a fully grown man. Fortunately, the girls easily understand that, so they decide to go take a bath without him. Till completely enjoys the warm water, and Pluriel mentions that she can't believe he's letting people of their status enjoy this luxury. Till assures her that that's just the kind of man Van is, and Pluriel says that he's constantly surprising her because he's an incredibly kind child, which is rare for a noble. Till excitedly agrees, saying that she can tell her a lot of things that make Van wonderful. Listing all of them will take time, but she can start by saying that, at just 2, Van excelled in his studies and with a sword. His boundless knowledge was on par with most adults, and with the sword, he was hailed as a prodigy for constantly beating the other boy soldiers. Till tells Pluriel everything she has to say, never holding back, and at night, Van can finally enjoy the baths on his own. Soon enough, Compson decides to join him, and Van is surprised to see that he's built up some muscle. Compson tells him that he's still scrawny compared to D, but Van assures him that everyone is scrawny compared to that man. He mentions that it must be nice having muscles like his, though he knows that he has been working incredibly hard at his sword training. Compson agrees, saying that he's doing his best to become like D so he can protect him. Van asks him to spare him, saying that he doesn't want him to be like D at all. Just then, D and his knights enter the baths with their swords, so Van tries to escape. D immediately stops him, saying that they must deepen their friendship like this, because bathing together warms the heart and body. Van has no choice but to stay, and once he returns to his room, he says that the bath felt good, despite all that happened. The next morning, Compson informs him that, thanks to the knights and everyone else, they now have a splendid trench. Van admits that it's indeed splendid, but he clarifies that it would be ideal for their defenses to fill it with water and make it a moat. They will also need water for drinking and for use in the bath, so they must secure a water source now. Without wasting any time, they quickly set about diverting water from a nearby river. Esparta instantly digs out a trench a few dozen meters long, while D, Compson, and the others continue it onward by hand. Van follows on behind, strengthening the bottom and sides of the trench, but D is having way too much fun doing his job for some reason. Till mentions that given the distance between village and river, this is some construction project, but Van reminds her that people can't live without water. It is hard work indeed, but having everyone pulling toward the same goal is kind of fun. Plus, once conditions are improved and less uncertain for everyone, it will be easier for merchants to visit too. They need to do this so he can live a laid-back life in the future, though it'll probably take them a week, so they just have to keep going. By the end of the day, Van swallows his own words when the knights tell him that they can already see the village up ahead. Van is beyond shocked because this is a crazy pace, and they did way more than he expected. He decides to ask them to stop, saying that that's enough for today, but D doesn't understand why. After all, if they keep this up, they'll be at the village in a few more hours. Van asks him to look around him and to look at Compson and the others. When D finally looks at them, he notices the poor guys trembling and completely exhausted, unable to keep going. D is clearly a little disappointed because he thought he had found a great new way to train for once, but he apparently shouldn't overdo it. Van can't believe that he still has the stamina to keep going after all that, and it's the same for Esparta, which is honestly scary. The next day, they finally finish the job way sooner than expected, so Van thanks them all for their fine contributions, saying that they have finally completed the canal to carry the water. He mentions that he knows it was a lot of hard work over this past day and a half, so he's truly grateful to all of them. Once he gives the order, Esparta finally opens the gate, letting the water run through the canal. Everyone cheers when they see the water flowing nice and steady, and the villagers are more than happy to finally have water in the village. Van is satisfied to see that it worked, though he mentions that it might flood when the rain makes it rise, so perhaps he should create a lake behind the village too. Esparta tells him that that's a great idea, because if they use that lake as a reservoir, it will prove useful during droughts. Van immediately approves the idea, so in no time, they create a huge lake behind the village. This is clearly a shock to everyone, because the village had no waterways before, but now they even have a lake for a reservoir. Now they don't have to worry about how to get water daily, and thanks to Van, they no longer need to trek to the river to fetch water. The village chief thanks Van for everything, but Van is simply glad that everyone has access to the water now, because now life will be easier for the whole village. In another scene, we see a little girl in a carriage, accompanied by a woman who prides herself on being as beautiful as a goddess. They're apparently heading for a remote village, but it's still a long way to go. In the meantime, Van uses his production magic to create a rampart, which is mostly complete now. This is a big step, because what used to be a wall of dirt has been strengthened further. Van tried mixing stone into the earth wall to make it strong like concrete, so it is now a sturdy rampart that will keep bandits from striking. Everyone feels a lot safer now, but Van still thinks that he should make them even safer. That's why he decides to create some basic ballistae, though no one but him thinks they're basic at all. Van explains that he attached shields to the front so they can fire bolts while protected from enemy attacks. Till is clearly impressed, like everyone else, and says that he can make all kinds of things with his production magic. Van mentions that this village may be a small one, but it's starting to look like a fortress city. Esparta agrees, saying that it's hardly a village anymore, and it's definitely a small fortress. Mere bandits will never conquer it now, however hard they try. D mentions that if Jalpa had known Van possessed this power, he would have been head of the house, or at least an advisor on development. Esparta tells him that he shouldn't say those things because he simply simply placed much more value on the head's ability to fight. D disagrees, saying that it only takes one look at all of this to tell that Van's power is more than sufficient for combat, and he might even argue he's more powerful than anyone else. Esparta clarifies that Van's power is best for protection, so it is unsuited to conquer lands. D insists and reminds him that war is more than just soldiers clashing with each other. Van quickly stops them from fighting any further, saying that frustration over circumstances or talents won't do them any good, so they all have to make do and fight with what they've got. Both Esparta and D are shocked by his words and composed demeanor, but D easily agrees, saying that lamenting their misfortune won't change a thing. He'll make a comeback, wherever they've driven him, and eventually, his own land will thrive. Esparta quickly stops him, asking him why he would suggest attempting to rival the Marquis. They're about to start arguing again, but this time, Van's growling stomach stops them, letting them know that he's hungry. Soon enough, he enjoys a good meal at the manor, and Till is glad to see he likes it, since she was worried because they don't have many ingredients. Van is clearly surprised to find out that they're short on food, and Esparta tells him that defense of the village is important, but they must do something about its regular income. He heard it has no connections, save for the merchants who come here maybe once a month. Van tells him that, for now, he can handle any homes and furniture they need, and the village's crops are able to provide plenty of food for them. Esparta reminds him that there are no seasonings, and they don't have the ingredients for the sweet-baked desserts he loves. Van immediately freaks out at that, so he starts seriously thinking about creating an industry, wanting to come up with something this village can sell. Everyone at the table decides to toss out some ideas, and Compson starts by saying that those wood blocks he can make would be good. Van quickly rejects the idea and explains that only he can work those, so they'd be useless for anyone else. Till then suggests hunting monsters for their materials, but Van doesn't even let her finish, rejecting her idea, because Ortho's group is capable of hunting monsters. Esparta tells him that if they're looking for something distinct from this village, that will be a challenge. Van just knows that he has to come up with something good, but he still has no idea what it'll be. Later that day, Zara, one of the adventurers, tells Van that he's truly well loved. After all, when he asked Till and Kamson to test their weapons to see what they could do, they refused, saying they don't want to ruin them since they're gifts from him. Van stares at them disapprovingly, so Kamson tries to explain that he truly treasures his sword. Till has nothing to say in her defense, so Van tells them that he's glad they cherish his gifts, but if they don't know what they can do with them, they won't be able to protect themselves when it matters. They're still a little reluctant to do so, but Zara assures them it'll be all good if he uses his shield of the Orc Knight. He proudly tells them that it's made of hide from an orc's back, so this fine shield is sturdy and flexible. Compson decides to try using his sword for the first time, but he barely touches the shield with it. Zara laughs at that weak attempt and tells him that he knows that he doesn't want to damage it, but such a light strike won't do anything. Before he can finish his sentence, his precious shield is cut in half, leaving everyone confused. Zara soon starts crying, because he just had this shield made, and he can't believe a wooden weapon could cut it in half. Van decides to use his production magic to repair the shield, so Zara finally stops crying. Ortho approaches them to see what all the commotion is about, but when he sees Van, he asks him if he'd buy some ores from them. He explains that the deep forest at the foot of the Wolfsbrook mountain range is filled with strong monsters. That might explain why they can find a lot of rare ores without going into the mountains. They found iron ore, and there's copper and silver too, and they even mined a little gold. On top of that, they also got mithril ore, which is pretty rare. Van is beyond surprised at the amount of rare ore they found in the forest, though he wonders why this has never been mined before. Ortho guesses that it's so out of the way and inconvenient to reach. The only exploration there was the chivalric order's initial evaluation. Van says that that makes sense, and if these were at the foot, then the Wolfsbrook Mountains must hold a wealth of resources. Without wasting any time, he decides to use the iron ore and manages to create a block out of it. He didn't melt it down to make it purer, so he doesn't know how pure it truly is now. Zara immediately asks him to try making him a sword with that, and Van decides to accept, saying that he still feels bad about his shield. Zara then excitedly asks him for one short sword and one long sword, though Ortho didn't know that he loved swords that much. Van tries to focus, because this is his first time making an iron weapon, so he has to think about every little detail. The ridge should be thicker than the edge, but the blade should be as sharp as possible, and the density of the metal is important too. In a matter of seconds, he manages to create a short sword for Zara, saying that he's his first customer, so he paid extra attention to the embellishments. Zara cries and screams from excitement, so Van wastes no time and creates a long sword as well. This one turns out pretty cool, so Ortho and the other adventurers immediately ask him to create swords for them too. Van is surprised that his swords are so well made even pros want them, and since they brought him those ores, he gladly accepts to make weapons for all the adventurers on the house. Pluriel observes Zara's sword up close, saying that she won't know for sure until they test it out some, but she thinks he could sell these for a lot. That sounds like a great idea for Van, and Esparta approaches him to inspect the rare mithril ore. He mentions that he's seldom heard of anyone mining metallic ores in woods, not mountains. With one exception, it would be possible if a dungeon were nearby. Zara says that no one really knows, because the place hasn't been surveyed all that well. Esparta tells Van that if they discover a dungeon, their situation would change massively, because hordes of people and goods would begin to flow in and out of this village. Van knows knows that the importance of this village would jump dramatically if they discover a dungeon. After all, dungeons are resource bonanzas, with gems as valuable as national treasures. Normally, when the guild receives word of a new dungeon, they open a branch in the nearest town or village. However, the village doesn't have the resources to welcome the guild right now, and the neighboring nation would attack them seeking to profit off the dungeon. Fortunato County next door is the most likely to attack them, and the problem is that he's the black sheep of the House Fertio. If they learn the land he was exiled to has value, he'll be sent somewhere else for sure. Pluriel tells him that he needs to grow this village and produce results before discovering the dungeon, because it'll be harder for House Fertio to intervene that way. The adventurers then decide to avoid where the dungeon's likely to be when they gather resources. Van knows that they would get a lot more out of reporting the discovery of a dungeon, so he's grateful that they're doing this for his sake. He decides to continue with the village renovations all day, but one of the villagers warns everyone that there are armored lizards coming from across the main road. Van immediately orders to raise the drawbridge and close the gates, and once this is done, he approaches the terrified villagers and tells them that the lives of everyone in this village rests on this important battle. That's why he's going to fight for everyone here, but he can't protect everyone with his strength alone, so he hopes they can all lend him their strength now to protect this village together. All the villagers accept helping out right away, so Van orders to man the ramparts. Compson informs him that Ortho's party went out hunting, so they're not in the village right now. Van tries to go up to the ramparts right away after hearing that, but Till suddenly stops him, clearly worried about him. She's not willing to let him go up there, so Van asks Dee to go up top and report down what's happening, because he'll issue orders from where he is. Dee immediately follows his orders, and once he's at the ramparts, he informs Van that there are roughly 40 armored lizards, and they are 8 meters tall. Those are really concerning numbers, so the situation is really bad, because even a bunch of veteran knights would struggle taking down a single armored lizard. Van doesn't waste any time and asks him to load the iron bolts into the ballistae. Dee follows his instructions right away, even though Arb and Law try to tell him that regular weapons won't work against their tough hides. Dee clarifies that he already knows that, and so far, despite some quite dismal odds, he has won all his battles. However, now he wants to give following Van's orders a try, so he orders to load those ballistae with iron bolts. All the villagers helping follow his instructions, and once all the ballistae are loaded, Dee orders them to fire. Unfortunately, the iron bolts completely vanish as soon as they hit the armored lizards, but Dee realizes that they actually went right through their heads. He informs everyone that they have shot down 10 armored lizards with that, which shows the might of the ballistae made by Van. However, Arb announces that they only have 1 iron bolt left for each now, and there's still enough of them to flatten the ramparts. Law says that they have to use the bolts now, so Dee orders everyone to reload the ballistae and fire. Soon, the second wave of armored lizards is down, but they're now out of iron bolts, and if they don't act, the village will be done for. Van tries to think what to do next, and then remembers Kamsan's training, when he cut Zara's shield in 2 with the wooden sword he gifted him. He immediately asks Dee to use the wooden bolts, but Law and Arb tell him that wood won't do much in this case, because they're armored lizards, and their scales are like steel. Dee interrupts them, saying that Van has already defied his expectations in countless ways. He protected this village from bandits, and then developed it at a tremendous pace, so he's going to put his faith in him. Without wasting any time, Dee orders to load the wooden bolts and prepare to fire. All the villagers follow through, and as soon as they fire, both Arb and Law are surprised to see that the wooden bolts are stuck in the armored lizards' heads. Fortunately, that worked pretty well, so Dee immediately orders to fire a second load of wooden bolts, saying that tonight, lizard kebab is on the menu. After several waves of wooden bolts, all of the armored lizards are finally down, and the village cheers for their victory. Van feels instant relief, because all enemies are now neutralized, and no one on their side even got injured. To top it all off, they only used a small number of bolts, so their victory was so overwhelming it's almost anticlimactic. Both Arb and Law are equally impressed by all of this, and Dee is now sure that Van is truly going to be a big deal, far bigger than he can ever imagine. The villagers immediately get to work with the defeated armored lizards once the adventurers return to the village. Ortho asks them to take care to preserve the eyes and fangs, saying that they can toss the guts, but they have to be sure to extract their magic cores. He mentions that, with a haul like this, the bodies often rot before they're done harvesting, but thanks to these knives Van made, they'll be done in no time. Van decides to check on everyone, and sees a huge pile of meat, which means that they can have a big feast. Later that night, all the villagers celebrate their victory with a big feast, and Rhonda is clearly pleased to see everyone so happy, since he never thought he'd see the day when they could laugh and enjoy good food again. They're also surprised that there actually is a noble who's not above joining in the revelry, though Esparta thinks that this still might be considered problematic behavior for a noble. Till dismisses his concerns and says that this is all part of Van's charm, and Compson happily agrees. In the meantime, Van enjoys the armored lizard grilled meat, since the outside is nice and crisp, but it's all soft and juicy inside. Ortho mentions that when he heard that the ballistae bolts were made of the same stuff as their weapons, it all made sense. Dee casually manages to hear that as he's walking by, and he freezes when he finds out that Van made swords for all of the adventurers. Ortho proudly brags about his sword, saying that it slices right through monster bones with without any resistance. Pluriel agrees, saying that hers is light, thin, and great at cutting, so it's a huge help. Zara excitedly says that his is amazing in both appearance and sharpness, so he's totally happy with his swords. Hearing all the nice opinions about the weapons, Dee immediately tells Van that he'll buy one too, and asks him how much for a great sword. Before Van can say anything, Arb quickly tells him that he'll take a long sword and a short sword, and Law decides that he'll have the same. Van starts feeling overwhelmed, so he nervously tells them that he couldn't possibly take money from them after all they've done for the village. That's why once the materials and the village's finances are in order, he'll make new gear for them. They finally calm down after his promise, and Ortho later mentions that if he sells the armored lizards to a merchant, he'll get about 20 gold for each one. Van is surprised that they're worth that much, but Ortho clarifies that in this case, most of the meat will spoil, so subtracting that and transport fees, they're about 8 gold each. They still have 40 of them, so that would be over 300 gold, which is still a great amount of money. Van tries to think how much that would be back in Japan, and realizes that it'd be roughly over 300 million yen. His surprise is interrupted by Esparta, who tells him that when a village or town makes over 100 gold, it is required to pay 50% to the marquis in the form of taxes. Van almost chokes on air after hearing that, and he nervously asks if there's a way to keep it a secret. Esparta tells him that it'd be impossible, because if they sell this much, it will be discovered at once. Van immediately feels defeated, because that means the 300 million he thought he'd be getting shrank to 150 million. However, the bigger problem is that his father will learn about the state of this village. If he learns that this place holds some value, he will exile him to a different remote area, and he won't get to live a nice, easy life in this village. Esparta clarifies that keeping this a secret may prove difficult, but there is one thing they can try. They'll have to report it to his older brother, Mersha, and give him the glory for defeating the armored lizards. Van sees that as an amazing idea, because his brother longs to add an achievement to his name, so this works well for both of them. The next day, two merchants visit the village, and they're both very confused when they see how good this remote village actually looks. Van introduces himself as the lord of this village, and the merchants immediately recognize him as Marquis Fertio's fourth son, the kid everyone was calling a prodigy. Van asks them for their names and the name of their company, so the merchant driving the carriage quickly introduces himself as Bell, saying that he's with the Merry Chamber of Commerce. He also mentions that the man with him is his younger brother, Rango, and Van decides to let them in, welcoming them to his village. As soon as they're in, both Bell and Rango are equally shocked when they see the huge piles of materials from armored lizards. They can't believe that this tiny village managed to strike down that many armored lizards, creatures so powerful that even adventurers fear them. Van happily asks them if they'll buy all of it from them, and Bell immediately accepts, saying that he'll go fetch some more men. He asks him if he's willing to wait for about a month so they can transport it all, and Van easily accepts, but clarifies that the meat won't keep that long, so they can take some for free. Bell greatly appreciates that, and in return, Van mentions that they also have some good quality weapons, so he'd like them to take a look. That takes them by surprise, because they didn't know that they had a blacksmith in this village. Van simply smiles, giving no explanations whatsoever, and soon enough, both Bell and Rango are amazed to see how wonderful the weapons truly are. They're clearly willing to buy these weapons, so Van thanks them and asks if they can also promote their weapons. That makes them hesitate for a moment, and Van quickly assumes that these brothers were thinking of getting a monopoly on them, which is really naive of them. He explains that if two merchants traveling the same route both start selling weapons, everyone's going to know the weapons were made in this village. That reasoning takes them by surprise, and Van tells them that it'd be best if they came up with a way to make more profit before they promoting them sends sales rocketing. The brothers can't argue against that, but they don't know how they'll achieve something like that. Van then clarifies that the best way is to set up a shop in this village, a shop the two of them would run. Both Bell and Rango seem to love the idea, so Van decides to go build their shop at once. That leaves them a little confused, and in a matter of seconds, Van builds the shop with his production magic. The brothers are clearly speechless by how fast that was, and Van tells them that he looks forward to doing business with them. Later that day, Esparta tells Van that he should plan a town for 10,000 people to live in. He explains that, if they consider future development, he believes they should build a fortress town that can hold 10,000. Van clearly wasn't expecting that, so he asks him if he can't just start with 1,000. Esparta firmly denies it, saying that given the current pace of this village's development, even 10,000 is a tad conservative. As they further develop this land, they'll also need plenty of people to guard the village and administer its facilities. Once that's clear, Esparta asks him if he has any ideas what kind of fortress town he wishes it to be. He explains that square fortress towns are the most common design, but Van tells him that he's actually thinking of making a star-shaped fortress town. That way, attackers will have to spend time conquering the pointy outcrops to get near the main keep. If they ignore them and go straight for the wall, they'll be attacked from 3 different angles. Esparta admits that it's a well-thought-out design, but before he can say anything else, Arb suddenly breaks into the room with urgent news, saying that an emissary from neighboring Ferdinando County is here. Soon after that, Van goes out to meet them and introduces himself to them right away. A woman introduces herself as Panamera Carrera Cayenne and proudly says that she recently became a viscountess, rising from the position of knight. night. The little girl next to her nervously says that she's the youngest daughter of Count Ferdinato, Arte on Ferdinato, and she's come to pay their respects on her father's instructions. Van tells them that he's grateful they made the long journey to this unremarkable village and invites them to have a seat. Panamera mentions that he's slightly younger than Arte from what she can tell, but he seems awfully composed. She asks him why he thinks they came here, and Van tells her that he's guessing it's to assess the state of their enemy and win him over. Panamera loudly laughs at that, saying that he's truly incredible because he's only 8 years old and he already worked that out. She lets him know that his theory is correct because he's been entrusted with land between his county and the kingdom of Yeleneta, so Count Ferdinato is wary of him. He fears he might spearhead Marquis Ferdio's unseemly ambitions. That said, Panamera mentions that sending a child who was being heralded as a prodigy out here suggests he can't use elemental magic. Van isn't surprised that she figured that out, because even if he hid that fact, it'd get out eventually. He tells her that she's correct, that he has no aptitude for elemental magic, but the Count's other concern is unwarranted, because he was simply exiled here by his father. Panamera sees that as a transparent lie, because he's turned a remote village of 100 people into a fortress in no time, and replaced old buildings with brand new structures. Even the lowest estimate suggests 5,000 men were dispatched with him in order to turn this remote village into a new military outpost. Van remains silent for a long moment, and then simply bursts out laughing, saying that the more serious she sounded, the funnier it got. Once he finally calms down, Van apologizes and decides to correct her misunderstanding. He explains that all his father allowed him to bring was Kamzan and a carriage load of luggage, and his family didn't even see him off. Panamera asks him to explain his butler, his knight, and his maid in that case. Dee quickly tells her that Van's talent with the sword and boundless generosity suggests he has a great future ahead, so he came of his own volition. He got orders from the chivalric order to return immediately, but he simply ignored them. Van tries to tell him that if he keeps ignoring those, he'll be kicked out of the order for sure, but Dee doesn't listen to him. On the other hand, Esparta explains that he's an old man, and when he learned Van was coming to the countryside, he felt it was a great opportunity to retire and follow him here. Now he's simply teaching Van everything he knows as a pastime in his old age. Lastly, Till explains that even though Van is a noble, he doesn't discriminate against those of lesser status like her. Van cares for others more than anyone, so she wishes to serve him forever, and that's why she's here. Panamera is clearly surprised after hearing them, and she can't argue against that, but she still asks him to explain the village's transformation. Van decides to show her in person, and after finding a good spot outside, he decides to make a rampart with his production magic. Esparta uses his elemental magic to create a huge wall of dirt, and Van uses his production magic to turn it into fiber blocks, which he uses to create a huge door. Both Panamera and Arte are very confused, and that's when Van tells them that he has an aptitude for production magic, which is considered the most unfortunate magic of all. The instant he knew he had production magic, his father drove him out of their home, so he doesn't know about his power. Panamera sees that as a total waste, because with his power, the Marquis could have expanded his influence drastically. She easily gives up on that, saying that she's not convinced, but she does understand now. Panamera then confesses that she was actually instructed to offer him Arte's hand in marriage. Van quickly understands why Arte came here as an emissary, as a way for him to take her and leave them alone. He clarifies that he plans to continue strengthening and developing this fortress town, but he doesn't seek conflict with anyone. As long as the Count gets that, that's enough for him, and there's no need for marriage. Panamera decides to be honest, saying that she was opposed to Arte getting engaged at such a young age. Whether he was talented or not, it was highly unlikely Arte would find happiness here. Van agrees, saying that she might be shunned or forced to live in a remote town with no money or goods, or she and the village could perish at the hands of bandits or monsters. Panamera explains that's why she came here intent on preventing Arte's engagement, but her feelings have changed, and she'd gladly welcome him marrying her now. That takes Van completely off guard, but Panamera tells him that he possesses greater foresight than a child should, the power to unite people behind him, the knowledge and willpower to overturn misfortune, and overwhelming power as a mage. Van is thrilled that she's praising him like that, and Panamera asks Arte how she feels about that. Arte hesitates, saying that she doesn't know yet, even if she considers that he's a good person. Van reassures her and says that he hasn't thought about marriage yet either, and it's an important decision, so they can take their time over it. Panamera clarifies that they have all day to think it over, because they're spending the night in the village. Van is clearly surprised at first, but he gladly accepts to make an inn for them to stay at right away. That night during dinner, Van tries to make some conversation with Arte, wanting to know her better. Despite all his efforts, he only gets short answers from her, since she's way too nervous to speak. However, after dinner, Arte decides to thank him for everything, saying that she was nervous when she thought she was getting engaged, but he's a really kind man, so it's a huge relief. After she leaves, Esparta mentions that given that the Count sent Arte to them with an offer of marriage, it's likely she's not an elemental mage either. Van quickly understands that it was hard for her to say that she was driven out of home like he was. He decides to prioritize Arte's wishes for now, because if she can't return home, then she can live in this village, engagement or no, and if she wants to go home, then she can. That night at the inn, Panamera mentions that she was planning to go back tomorrow, but she asks Arte if they should stay a few more days. Arte instantly gladly accepts, deciding that she'll try to initiate conversations with Van next time she sees him. The next morning, Till and Compson rush into Van's room to wake him up, saying that there's something urgent going on, and Dee and Esparta are already hurrying to the site. Van asks them what site they're talking about, and Till tells him that it's the lake he created behind the village the other day, Lake Van. The name takes him a little off guard, so while they walk towards the lake, Van asks them how they came up with that name. Till explains that the villagers named it that to honor his deeds for generations to come, and Compson mentions that they're thinking about naming the village Van Village. Van immediately cuts him off, saying that that sounds all kinds of bad. When they finally reach the lake, a lot of villagers are already gathered there, and Van sees a girl floating in the middle of the lake, staring at them in silence. That clearly throws him off, so Esparta explains that she's an apkallu, a half-human, half-fish species. They're reputed to live in picturesque rivers and deep forests, but for some reason, a number are here in this lake he made. Dee mentions that they are a rare species that few ever encounter, and that's why the villagers are so surprised. Knowing this, Van tries to ask the girl if she needs something and what her name is, but he receives no answer to any of his questions. He starts doubting if she can even understand what he's saying, and decides to ask Till and Compson to bring some meat. Once they do, Van offers the girl a plate of grilled lizard meat, knowing that offering food is always a good way to demonstrate friendship. With this, the girl finally starts approaching him, and then emerges from the water to ask him if she can eat that. Van gladly allows her to, and the little girl takes a bite, instantly surprised by the flavor. He informs her that it's armored lizard meat, and tells her that he can make some jerky if she'd like more tomorrow. The girl immediately asks him who defeated the armored lizards, and before he can respond, Esparta, Dee, and the whole village confidently say that it was Van who did it. Van tries to remind them that it was all thanks to them, but the girl quickly understands and decides to disappear into the water. Van doesn't understand what that was all about, and he doesn't know if the girl will be back. Esparta tells him that their species is rarely sighted, so she likely won't return for some time. That stands to reason, so Van decides to leave it like that, but the next day, he's terrified to see that there are even more apkallu in the lake this time. Till recognizes the girl from before, the one who asked them who defeated the armored lizards. Van nervously asks if the apkallu view armored lizards as gods or something, but Esparta clarifies that he has never heard of such a belief. A man who looks like the leader of the apkallu speaks, saying that he would like to speak with the young man. Van already knows that he's talking about him, but he's clearly nervous, because the man has a really scary look, and he doesn't know what he wants. Despite his concern, the man simply thanks him for being kind to his daughter, and Van quickly realizes that his daughter is the girl from before. The man tells him that he also heard that he's the one who defeated the armored lizards. Van admits that it appears that's what everyone has agreed on, and all the apkallu are shocked that a young child could achieve such a thing. He tries to clarify that he didn't defeat them on his own, but the leader of the apkallu calls him a hero and tells him that he has his permission to marry his daughter, Lada Priora. Van is taken off guard once again, so the man asks him if the arrangement dissatisfies him. He finally introduces himself as Lada Vesta and says that Lada Priora is his only daughter, but when she grows up, her beauty will shine as bright as any precious gem. Van still hesitates and mentions that Lada Priora is still a child, so he doesn't think she understands what he's suggesting. He decides to ask him why he's offering her hand in marriage, wanting to know if there is a reason behind it. Lada Vesta explains that until now, his people have avoided making ties with humans, but in recent years, armored lizards have encroached on their rivers, and many numbers have been lost. That is why he seeks someone strong to become Lada Priora's husband, because he wants to secure a place for them to live in peace. Van quickly understands that Lada Vesta is offering his daughter as a bride in order to forge an alliance with a powerful human. Once this is clear, Van tells him that the marriage part is unnecessary and asks him to allow his daughter to marry whomever she chooses in the future. Lada Vesta quickly assumes that he's refusing, but Van clarifies that he's just saying that he'll protect his tribe regardless of any marriage. This takes him by surprise, but Lada Vesta gladly accepts, saying that they will all settle in this lake in that case. Since that's settled, Van wastes no time and starts building, using his production magic to create 2 rest areas in the middle of the lake. He tells him that everyone can use it at their leisure, since it's very spacious, and it seems like a nice, relaxing place. Till and Compson agree, saying that they will be safe in here even when it's gusty and rainy. Soon enough, all the apkallu are enjoying the nice rest areas, and Van is glad that everyone's enjoying themselves. Esparta reminds him that it is nearly time to deal with the sewage, but Lada Vesta asks them what they're going to do. Van explains that he has placed sewer pipes underneath the buildings in the village, and they regularly send water from the moat down them to flush away all the sewage, because it would get unsanitary otherwise. Once this is clear, Lada Vesta asks him to let them help him in that case, because they excel at working in the water. Van gladly accepts their help, and soon enough, some apkallu go underwater to open the sewage doors and flush the pipes of the village. Van thanks them for their help, since that went really well, and Lada Vesta asks him if they do that every day. When Van tells him that they do it several times a day, Lada Vesta asks him to allow them to take on the task of handling the sewage for them. Van asks him if that's really okay, and Lada Vesta simply asks him to consider it thanks for letting them live here. That would be a huge help, so Van gladly accepts, and that's when Panamera and Arde show up to see what he's doing. Panamera freezes as soon as she sees the apkallu, and Arde mentions that she has never seen them before. Latavesta tells Van that he has his gratitude for his kind welcome, but what's shocking for Panamera and Arte is that he called Van his son-in-law. Panamera immediately asks him if he married an Apkalu, and Van quickly tries to clear the misunderstanding, but Lada Priora emerges from the water to confirm it, saying that she's Van's wife. This shocks him even more, but before he can say anything, Lada Priora disappears, leaving him in a harsh position. The next morning, Van decides to have some time alone with Arte, and apologizes for calling her so early. He explains that he simply thought it might be nice to take in the morning air on the lake. Arte tells him that it's fine, since she also likes taking in the morning air, and it's very refreshing. Van is glad to hear that, and he decides to talk about that Apkalu from yesterday. Arte clarifies that she already heard the story from Panamera, and it seems like they both misunderstood, so she apologizes for jumping to conclusions. Van is happy that that's ironed out, at last, and Arte tells him that he built this lake and developed the village so much, so he's truly incredible. He quickly dismisses all her praise, saying that it was all thanks to everyone else helping him. Arte smiles, but that's when Lada Priora shows up, greeting Van and calling him her husband again. She stares at Arte for a little too long, so Van nervously tells her that they were just having a private conversation. Before he can explain any further, other Apkalu kids surround the boat saying that it's the meat man or the lord. They all put their hands on the boat, making them lose balance until Arte falls against Van's chest and everyone goes silent. Soon, all the kids start laughing at them, but it's clear that Lada Priora doesn't look happy at all. She asks Van if he's alright, but she calls him her husband again, so Van reminds her that he already explained to her father that they're not engaged. This clearly puts her in a worse mood, so she simply sinks into the water without saying another word, and the Apkalu kids tell Van that he just bullied her. That's why they all start rocking the boat on purpose, trying to make them fall again. Van loses his balance and tries to make them stop, saying that he'll give them some armored lizard meat if they do. Soon after that, Latavesta approaches Van with a terrifying expression, saying that Lada Priora told him all about it, and he can't believe that he was flirting with another woman when he already has his daughter. Van tries to remind him that he's not her husband, but Latavesta interrupts him and says that they will hold a competition. He will compete against his people, and if the Apkalu win, he will officially recognize his betrothal to his daughter. Van is clearly not thrilled about the idea, but before he can say anything, Dee suddenly shows up and accepts the challenge, telling Van that he'll bring him victory. Esparta seems to agree with this, saying that setting this quickly might let him focus more on his studies. Panamera also thinks that it sounds interesting, but Van is clearly worried about what'll happen if they lose. Till and Kamsen quickly reassure him and remind him that he never loses, though Van knows that they're too biased toward him. Latavesta leaves him no choice, saying that they must settle this with a 3-round competition. He tells him that he can choose the nature of the first contest, so Van tries to think of what it could be. Soon enough, he comes up with an idea and explains to everyone the rules of volleyball, saying that if they land the ball in their opponent's zone, they score a point. Esparta mentions that he's never seen nor heard of such a sport, and Till is surprised that Van knows something that even Esparta doesn't. That aside, both Panamera and Dee are very happy with the swimsuits he made for them, since they're very comfortable. Kamsen and Till are also wearing swimsuits for what's coming, but Till is simply admiring Panamera, saying that she's what every woman aspires to be. Kamsen is just surprised that she's joining their side, and Panamera clarifies that she needs Van to get engaged to Arte. Without wasting more time, the first contest begins, and Latavesta and his daughter are on the Apkalu team, while Panamera and Till are on Van's team. Latavesta acts as server and hits the ball above the net with incredible strength, and he's so fast that Till barely has any time to react before the ball hits the water, scoring the Apkalu the first point. Van clearly wasn't expecting them to be so good at this, since it's a game nobody knows. In no time, both Latavesta and Lada Priora score even more points, and Van realizes that they're truly getting crushed. Till is very exhausted at this point, but Panamera tries to cheer her up, asking her if that's the extent of her passion. She reminds her that it's game over if she gives up, and encourages her to fight on. Latavesta tells them that it's futile, but Till and Panamera do their best, and manage to score a point together. Everyone cheers, but Latavesta and his daughter continue scoring points, having no mercy. Panamera and Till manage to claw them back, so it's now level, and the next one to score will win. Despite all their effort, Latavesta and Lada Priora win the match, but Panamera reassures Till, saying that they'll have to start over from nothing. Van decides not to comment anything about that, and Latavesta tells him that they will decide on the next event, which will be swimming. The contest will be a 2-person relay, and Van is clearly worried now, because if they lose one more event, he has to marry Lada Priora, but the Apkalu are master swimmers. Dee asks him to leave it to him, saying that he can swim, and Kamsen also offers himself, willing to give it his all for Van's sake. Van is clearly surprised at first, but he allows them to compete, and Kamsen is the first one to try, racing Lada Priora in the water. She's fast from the very start, quickly leaving Kamsen behind, but he desperately swims to close the gap between them. Kamsen manages to catch up to her in no time, so Lada Priora decides to go underwater, swimming even faster. When it's time for Dee to take over, he rapidly advances with a butterfly stroke, and Van is clearly confused by that. Arb explains that Dee is at his fastest when he swims like that, and Law tells him that that stroke lets him use his steel-like muscles to the fullest. Latavesta can see how fast Dee truly is, and he doesn't know how he's doing something like that. Dee somehow manages manages to win the swimming contest, and all the villagers cheer, but that's when Van sees Dee's swimsuit floating in the water. Without thinking, Dee comes out of the water and runs toward Van to celebrate, so Arb and Law quickly draw their swords to cover his parts. Latavesta still can't believe that they lost at swimming, but there is still one event left, and Van has to decide what it will be. After thinking for a bit, Van uses his production magic to create an ice shaver, and he asks Pluriel to produce some ice. Once she does, Van uses the machine to make some shaved ice and adds different flavored syrups to each of them. This is clearly new for everyone, so Van explains that the last event will be a shaved ice speed eating contest. They'll compete in teams of 2, and he'll take part this time, so he'll need a teammate. Arte nervously asks him if it would be alright for her to participate, and that surprises everyone, but no one is against the idea. Soon enough, Van and Arte prepare for the contest, and he starts wondering if he made these shaved ice way too big. Panamera clarifies that it's not too late to trade places, but Arte tells her that she'll be okay, even though she's clearly nervous. The contest finally begins, so they all start eating shaved ice as fast as they can, but they all get brain freeze at the same time. Latavesta stubbornly keeps eating, wanting to win the contest for his daughter. Van is completely frozen, thinking that they might be done for, but when he sees that Arte hasn't given up, he decides to keep trying, and eats many scoops in a matter of seconds. Arte decides to do her best as well, and in the end, they both win the contest, and Latavesta accepts their defeat. Van is glad to know that they can stop all this talk of marrying Lata Priora, but Latavesta tells him that he's taken an even greater liking to him. He calls him his son-in-law again, and says that he truly is the man worthy of his daughter. Van asks him what the point of winning was in that case, but Latavesta ignores him and leaves, asking him to continue to take good care of his daughter. Van doesn't even have time to protest, because his stomach starts hurting from eating too much shaved ice. Everyone is still glad that they won either way, and Arte is happy to see him like that, because Van is always surrounded by lots of smiling faces. She starts wondering how she can get to enjoy that, and if she can make that happen for her too. Since the day she was born, her father was always busy, so she barely ever saw him. Her mother handed her off to her wet nurse and showed no interest in her, and there was a simple reason for that, which was that she was a failure. Arte was quite timid and picky. She was no good at studying, and she didn't excel at anything, save perhaps for her marionette magic. Using her dolls as puppets, she found she could move them more freely than her own body, so she thought she might be able to delight her mother with it. However, her mother only slapped her face and told her that she brought her such grief. That was when Arte first learned marionette magic is considered evil and abhorred among the nobility. After that day, no one spoke to her at all, and she became someone everyone ignored. Then, when she turned 10, his father informed her that she would be getting engaged to someone. She was filled with anxiety, but Van was very kind to her, and then she learned that Van's aptitude wasn't for elemental magic, but for production magic, which others considered unfortunate. Despite that, Van was brimming with confidence and talent, and he made use of his gifts with optimism. Perhaps if she hadn't stopped practicing her magic after that day, she could be a little more like him. That's why Arte decides that she's going to try a little harder as well. The next day, Van says that they'll build more ramparts with an eye toward the village's future development. He asks all the villagers to take the utmost care to work safely and avoid injuries, and informs them that since tomorrow's a day off, they'll be hosting a big barbecue tonight. All the villagers cheer, and they're more than motivated to work harder now. When Arte greets him, Van notices that she seems more energetic than usual, and assumes that something happened. Arte doesn't deny it, and for a moment, she wants to see things the way he sees them, so she gathers the courage to ask him if she can watch him work. Van gladly accepts, which makes her really happy. In the meantime, Ortho and the adventurers are desperately running away from something dangerous in the forest, and it seems like they're about to get caught. 2 weeks later, thanks to everyone's help, Van has finished building the ramparts he wanted. Panamera mentions that she's still shocked at what he can do in so little time, even if they helped out. Van stares at her for a little too long, thinking that her ramparts are jutting out the most, but he's not foolish enough to say that out loud. He instead just tells her that they'll build more houses as more people like merchants and adventurers move here. Panamera tells him that she's positively envious of him, because it's been her dream to have her own land. In the next battle, she'll just have to earn more glory than money can reward, and ask for her own patch. Leaving that aside, she asks him what the things on top of the ramparts are, and Van tells her that they're ballistae. He explains that he tried crafting larger versions of the simple ballistae he had made before. Top and bottom can fire separately this time, so they can loose 2 bolts in a row. Van asks Kamsen to test fire one of the ballistae for them, and when he does, the bolt reaches an incredible distance, creating a huge explosion. Van smiles, seemingly satisfied, saying that they came out quite well, while the others stare in shock at the power of those ballistae. Panamera asks him if he really has ballistae that powerful atop his ramparts, and Van calmly tells her that he has over 100 of them. That takes her off guard, but she quickly recovers her composure to ask him to name his price, since she wants to buy one. Van smiles and clarifies that these aren't for sale, so Panamera has no other choice but to tell him that she'll owe him a favor in exchange for one of these ballistae. That's the only way for Van to agree, saying that he'll give her one, and he'll call in that favor later. He then asks her how she'll transport it and about the bolts to load into it. Panamera admits that it does look rather heavy, so she'll arrange a carriage, and since the bolts are made from iron, she can craft those on her end. Kamsen intervenes to tell her that she should take at least one one or two of Van's bolts. Panamera doesn't understand why, so Kamsen decides to show her his sword, asking her to take a look at it. At first glance, she mentions that she's never seen a sword with that shape before, and it seems like it'd make heavy work of foes with armor and shields. Kamsen asks her if she has a sword she doesn't mind breaking, so Panamera draws her spare sword. She says that she doesn't mind if it breaks, but she warns him that this beauty of a sword has seen her through several battles before, so she'd be impressed if he even managed to chip it. Kamsen takes her word for it and immediately swings his own sword against hers, but Panamera is left a little confused because there was hardly an impact and he just grazed her sword. Before she can say a word, the top of her sword falls to the ground, letting her know that Kamsen split it in two with that graze alone. Till smiles, not even a little surprised, as she mentions how impressive that was and what an incredible edge his sword has. Kamsen agrees, saying that it's like that because Van made it. Panamera snaps out of her shock to ask him what material that sword is made of. Van tells her that it's ordinary iron, and the bolts he made for the ballistae are made the same way he did that sword, so they pierce through 2 or 3 armored lizards. Panamera is shocked that they pierce through armored lizards at all, but she tries to keep it together and calmly asks him if she could have some bolts in addition to the ballista in that case. Van cheerfully agrees, saying that it's a pleasure doing business with her. Panamera tells Kamsen that he has her gratitude because thanks to him, she'll also have powerful bolts. Just then, the adventurers suddenly run out of the forest and approach the village, asking everyone to run for their lives. Ortho apologizes, saying that they couldn't outrun it, and that's when a huge dragon comes out of the forest. He informs Van that they'll distract it to buy them some time, and he must use that to get everyone back to the village. Van realizes that the adventurers plan to be decoys for them, but he knows that that would put Ortho's party in danger. However, fighting back here would endanger the villagers, so he doesn't know what to do. Panamera notices his inner conflict and tells him that she'll aid him because it's only a matter of time before the dragon heads this way. Without wasting any time, Van asks Ortho to go to them, saying that they'll shoot it down with the ballistae. Panamera warns everyone that they'll be fighting a forest dragon, a mid-class dragon with no breath weapon. She immediately asks for someone to escort Artie back to the village, and she orders the rest of them to hurry up onto the ramparts, saying that she'll be right behind them. While everyone moves to their positions, Van approaches Artie and apologizes for exposing her to such terrifying danger, since forest dragons are very powerful foes. However, he assures her that it'll be alright, because this time they have their enhanced ballistae, and they have Panamera as well. They might not be able to slay it, but they won't be beaten. Once Artie understands this, Van asks Till to escort Artie and to summon D and his men from the village. Till follows his order without wasting any time, while the adventurers continue running towards them. They're clearly panicking and fearing for their lives, hoping that they don't close the gates on them. Van waits for them, knowing that flying enemies are trouble, so it won't be good if the dragon reaches the village. He orders everyone on the ramparts to ready the ballistae and to make sure not to hit Ortho's party. Once this is done, Van tells them that they'll first ground the dragon, so they must aim for its wings. Just then, one of the adventurers trips and falls, but he asks the others not to worry about him and go. Ortho quickly goes out of his way and tries to distract the dragon, but it doesn't work at all. That's why Zara has no other choice but to throw his sword at the dragon, and soon enough, the enemy goes after them. Thanks to this, the other adventurer is saved, but now the situation has turned desperate for the others. Ortho keeps his composure and orders Zara to head for the ramparts now that the dragon is focusing on him. This makes Zara panic, but Ortho assures him that he's the fastest member of their party, and he has faith that he'll make it back alive. Zara doesn't know if he really means that, but he continues running, and Ortho asks everyone to never forget his sacrifice. That only makes Zara run faster, saying that he'll get him back for this. That aside, Van tells everyone at the ramparts that they must fire the ballistae once the dragon is within range, before it can get a taste of Zara. Zara somehow manages to hear that while he's running, and he asks Van if he's sure he's not trying to be mean. Once the dragon is within range, they fire the ballistae, but the dragon easily dodges the bolts and keeps chasing after Zara. Panamera tells him that she's best suited to stopping its advance, and she announces her first strike. Van is a little surprised by that, but he already figured as much, because being valued by the Count at such a young age and being made Viscountess for her exploits can only mean one thing. Panamera is undoubtedly a top-class elemental mage, and her aptitude will soon become very obvious. While she's at the top of the ramparts, Panamera uses her elemental magic, gathering a huge fireball on top of her hand. She fires the dragon with a powerful fire javelin, immediately taking it down and creating a major explosion. Despite that incredible strike, Kamsen warns them that the dragon is not down yet, since it's still moving. Van notices the gravity of the situation and realizes that he grew arrogant after slaying those armored lizards, but this is on a different level. Soon enough, the dragon stands up and flies into the sky again, completely unharmed. Van remains firm and orders everyone to fire all ballistae, and even though the dragon continues dodging most of the bolts, they manage to shoot through its wings. As soon as the forest dragon hits the ground, Van orders to fire all bolts at once. The dragon manages to read their second volley and dodges all the bolts at high speed. In the meantime, the adventurers sigh in relief when they get to the gates, glad that they made it back alive somehow. Zara, on the other hand, warns Ortho that he won't forget how he was treated, but Van is just glad to see everyone safe for now. However, he knows that if they stay here, they'll be in danger, and he would love to retreat to the village, but it's impossible in this situation. Panamera Panamera suddenly tells him that she'll buy him time and immediately attacks with another fire javelin. This time, the dragon dodges that attack as well, but Panamera redirects her attack so it hits it anyway. The explosion created is even greater than the last one, and Van realizes that that's the true pinnacle of fire magic. If she wasn't facing a dragon, that power and versatility would have been devastating for sure. Panamera comes down from the ramparts to his side and tells him that she'll head back first and prepare to intercept it. Once she leaves, Van orders everyone to take this chance to flee to the village. They all follow his orders at once, while Panamera's fire continues burning the dragon, completely consuming its wings. Van stops running for a moment to look back and sees the forest dragon on the ramparts, clearly enraged after losing its wings. It should have been seriously wounded by that last attack, so he's surprised that it is still standing. Esparta calmly heads towards the dragon, but Van doesn't know what he's doing, so he asks him to hurry up and run. However, Esparta doesn't stop, so Van desperately tells him that he won't run unless he's with him too. Only then, Esparta stops, saying that that would be troublesome. He asks Van to let him buy some time just this once, and then he'll head back with the others. Before Van can even respond, the forest dragon lands in front of Esparta, who doesn't move from his spot. He calmly uses his elemental magic to create a curved earth wall that rises above the dragon. Soon enough, giant pieces of rubble fall, hitting the dragon's head and burying it alive. Esparta then turns to face Van and tell him that that should buy them a fair amount of time. Van is left a bit speechless at how nonchalant Esparta is, because that was way too casual. He quickly asks Esparta to run instead of walking away that casually, but Esparta simply doesn't listen and continues walking. Van then tells him that if he puts some effort into it, he'll get him that red wine he likes. Esparta tells him that running is harsh on his old bones, but he'll try his best. Kamsin tries to reassure Van, saying that he'll stay by Esparta's side, so he must go ahead and take charge of the village's defenses. Van wastes no time and runs towards the village, but he knows that it's still quite a distance despite all his running. Ortho's party is almost fit to drop as well, so he needs to buy more time or the forest dragon will be on them again. Panamera then informs him that they're in position, so Van asks her if she minds if he calls in that favor right now. She agrees without a problem, so Van asks her to use that magic she did earlier to pin the forest dragon down when it reaches the ramparts, and only then they'll hit it with a barrage from the ballistae. Panamera seems satisfied and admits that it's a good plan, though she never would have thought that her magic would be used to merely pin down an enemy. Van apologizes for that and tells her that he'll share the dragon meat with her, so he hopes she can forgive him. Panamera only laughs and easily agrees, and that's when the forest dragon finally emerges from the rubble. Van immediately asks the ballistae to prepare to fire, saying that they need to be sure to draw back far enough before firing. He wishes he could buy just a little more time, but that's when D, Arb, and Law finally arrive. D doesn't wait any longer and runs directly towards the dragon, while Arb and Law can't keep up with him, so Van asks them if they'll be okay. D reassures him, saying that they have the weapons he made after all, so they'll surely be alright. However, when D clashes his sword against the dragon's claws, it doesn't go through them as he thought. Arb and Law quickly cover his back, but the forest dragon sends them all flying in no time with only one blow. That's when Esparta intervenes and creates an earth wall to protect them from the dragon. Van asks Esparta and Kamsin to hurry, and D decides to retreat with his men. They all run from the dragon, but their efforts at least have drawn it in close enough, so Van asks Panamera to do her part. Panamera immediately uses her elemental magic to cast a powerful flare blast, creating a greater explosion that surrounds the forest dragon in flames. Without wasting any time, Van orders to fire all ballistae at once, and soon enough, the forest dragon finally stops moving. Everything goes quiet, so D cautiously approaches the dragon, which suddenly opens its mouth and tries to eat him. D quickly reacts and manages to dodge that, and he immediately uses his sword to cut the dragon's head entirely. Van finally allows himself to sigh in relief, and informs everyone that they have won, so they must raise their voices in victory. Arte soon approaches him to check on him, and she's glad to see he's okay. Panamera tells her that she's unharmed as well, so she doesn't have to worry at all. That aside, she tells Van that he gave good commands, and congratulates him on slaying a dragon. Van mentions that they cut it very close though, but Panamera clarifies that regular villagers would have been wiped off the map. Heroes like his butler, Esparta, and D, the man who beheaded that dragon in one stroke, aren't very common. Van smiles in agreement, saying that he's proud to call them his friends. Panamera pokes his head and mentions that he also had those ballistae with their ridiculous force. She can't even believe that they were able to pierce a dragon's scales. Despite that, Van says that he'll need to upgrade them even more after this, because they need to be capable of firing 10 successive bolts at least. Panamera calmly mentions that she feels like he just said something completely terrifying. Van quickly dismisses it and says that they need to host a dragon-slaying ceremony for now. Panamera tells him that the most distinguished in battle receives the title of Dragon Slayer, and that would be D. Van is taken by surprise by that because it means D is being made a dragon slayer. Later that day, Van informs all the villagers that they have slain the Lord of the Forest, a forest dragon. They're all gathered to honor the deeds of those who contributed the most. He gives Panamera the word next, introducing her as the head of House Cayenne. Panamera says that the forest dragon they slew today would have wiped most villages and towns off the map, and most fortress cities wouldn't have fared much better. And yet, this small village not only survived, but suffered absolutely no casualties. Even the total damage was only a small portion of the ramparts and 2 ballistae. Panamera announces that she will now call out the names of those who contributed most. First up is D, deputy commander of House Ferdio's chivalric order, who beheaded the forest dragon in one fell stroke, dealing the decisive blow in the battle. Next is the exceptional elemental mage, Esparta, because words can't describe his talent for magic that let him pin the dragon down. Lastly, Panamera mentions House Ferdio's 4th son, Van Ne Ferdio, because his knowledge, decisiveness, and genius are rare in a boy of 8, and he has made unprecedented use of his magic to greatly strengthen this village's defenses in a short time. In the battle with the forest dragon, he took charge and led their men to victory as lord of this land. Van smiles, clearly surprised and pleased to be recognized for his efforts. Panamera looks at him with a smile, because she's met people of every status on her rise from lowly knight, but there has never been anyone like Van. She was born into a long line of knights in the royal capital, but when her aptitude for magic was known, she was quickly handed to the county that offered her the best conditions. Her grueling training made her wish for death, and she sacrificed sleep to study in her quest to become a squad commander. Her feats were recognized, and she was made commander of the county's chivalric order at age 16. After that, she fought in several battles, earning enough glory to be made a noble. The king was delighted with her success, so 6 very short years later, she was given the title of Viscountess. Then, one day, she was summoned by Count Ferdinando, who told her that he wished to wed his youngest daughter to the lord of some remote land. That's when she met Arte for the first time, and Panamera tried her best to be kind to her. After all, when she left her parents long ago, she was filled with anxiety, so perhaps she projected herself onto Arte. Her fears were all for nothing though, because after meeting Van, Arte began taking the initiative to push things forward. That's why Panamera decides to announce that she hereby vows to forge an equal alliance with Van Ne Ferdinando. Up until now, they haven't had any support from the Marquis, but if they ally themselves with her, she can promise them support. They won't have to worry about Count Ferdinando's knights invading either. Van is taken by surprise by this, but he knows that it's true that if he forges an alliance, he'll replace enemies with allies, and it'll also help financially. Panamera tells him that he manages to develop this village in no time, so he should set his sights even higher. If he forges an equal alliance with her, the nobles of this kingdom will soon learn that Van Ne Ferdio is her sworn friend. Van knows that with his father cutting him off and few connections among the nobility, this is a great opportunity he may never get again. That's why he decides to accept Panamera's offer, and tells her that he hopes their friendship holds strong.